First, we will take Eastern Europe. Next, the masses of Asia. Then we shall encircle the last bastion of capitalism, the United States of America. We shall not have to attack. It will fall like an overripe fruit into our hands. Paraphrased and summarized, that in essence is the plan for world conquest outlined by Vladimir Lenin, father of Russian communism. No matter who the Kremlin boss has been since Lenin's death in 1924, the communists have never deviated from this master plan, nor on the strategy necessary to carry it out. It is still their blueprint for conquest today. Complete world domination is the ultimate goal. The major target, the great prize, the United States of America. General Carlos Romulo, ambassador from the Philippines, past president of the United Nations General Assembly, sounded this urgent warning in a Reader's Digest feature article. America, wake up. The editors of the Reader's Digest commented,
"A wise and loyal friend of the United States warns us, the Cold War is a real war. It's far later than we know. The communists can win without changing their tactics. We cannot win without changing ours. We must assume the offensive. We dare not stand still."
To better understand this threat to our freedom, we will piece together many bits of recent history. This ideological warfare actually began November 7th, 1917, when barely 8 months after the uprising that dethroned Tsar Nicholas II, Lenin and his Bolsheviks overthrew the first democratic government in Russian history. Terrorists' methods crushed all but sporadic resistance, and by 1922, the Reds controlled most of Russia. In that year, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was formed by Lenin and his henchmen. Since then, bit by bit, the communists have steadily pushed toward their goal of world domination. They have used bribery, lies, bluff, brutality, the most extensive and most successful espionage network in world history, mass murder on a scale never before dreamed of, and every possible means to advance them along the road to world conquest, always guided by Lenin's blueprint. World War II proved to be an aid to Soviet ambitions for a world communist empire. Stalin made his notorious deal with Hitler in August of 1939, and the following month the German panzer divisions rolled into Poland. In just 4 weeks, Russia and Germany were cutting up Poland, dividing the spoils. The Reds moved next against tiny Finland. The Finns fought courageously, but Moscow got a toehold in the little Baltic nation. And soon thereafter, the Reds infiltrated Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, taking over the three little nations from within. The Baltic people resisted, not in an organized way, but individually. Hundreds of thousands of freedom-loving people were seized, thrown into cattle cars, and sped off to Siberian slave labor camps. The Soviet timetable for conquest was interrupted when Germany turned on the Kremlin and invaded Russia. As Germany drove deep into Russia, the vast numbers of Russian fighting men with American Lend-Lease aid proved a formidable obstacle. This, combined with our own bombing raids and ground strength, broke the German armies. But the onrushing Allied forces were halted from going through Eastern Germany, Czechoslovakia, and the Balkans by a fateful decision of our government leaders. And the stage was set for Stalin's execution of the first phase of Lenin's master plan, the takeover of Eastern Europe. While maintaining the fiction of a coalition government, the communists gradually reorganized each state along Soviet lines and liquidated or discredited all organized opposition. Their task was made easier by the years of Nazi repression, which had weakened democratic groups. Non-communist parties lacked funds and the generous support that was forthcoming from Moscow for local communists. However, the supreme advantage enjoyed by the communists was the close proximity of the Red Army and the inaction of the Western nations. Arthur Bliss Lane resigned his post as ambassador to Poland and put on record in his book, I Saw Poland Betrayed, what he had witnessed of communist ruthlessness and the unaccountable apathy of American and British statesmen. Ambassador Lane wrote,
"Our policy of appeasement toward Soviet Russia undoubtedly emboldened Stalin to go ahead with his plans for the complete domination of Poland. as of all other countries of Eastern Europe.
In 1947, Poland was forced into the growing family of satellites. A year later, while the West remained apparently oblivious, Czechoslovakia was added. Once the freest nation in Central Europe, Czechoslovakia was an ally of the West, and the Red Army had withdrawn in the fall of 1945. However, President Beneš was pressured into forming a provisional government of the National Front, in which the key posts of ministries of Interior, Defense, Information, and Agriculture were held by communists or fellow travelers. On February 25, 1948, with the army, police, and all means of communication in communist hands, Beneš yielded to communist strongman Gottwald's ultimatum, and Czechoslovakia became a satellite of the Soviet Union. On March 10th, 2 weeks after the communists seized power, Foreign Minister Jan Masaryk was found dead below the window of his office. An Associated Press Foreign Affairs editor wrote this memorable dispatch.
Jan Masaryk, although deeply devoted to democracy, thought he could do business with communism. His suicide is a monument to his recognition and a warning to the world that no such course is possible.
In September, at the age of 64, Edvard Beneš, president of the Republic of Czechoslovakia, was dead. Even the communists could not deny him a state funeral, and a tearful nation lined the streets of Prague to mourn the death of a man and a republic. So fell one by one the Eastern European nations, victims of Soviet infiltration, subversion, or force. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Albania, until almost all of Eastern Europe had disappeared behind a curtain of iron. In Greece and Austria, where we acted to give real assistance to those who resisted, the Red advance was stalled, but they continued the drive for power in Western Europe. Where internal revolt has little chance of success, the Reds work to establish a so-called democratic socialist government where they can entrench themselves until the Communist Party takes over. John Strachey, a top official in the Labour Socialist Party of Great Britain, was for many years an openly avowed communist. In his book, The Theory and Practice of Socialism, he wrote,
"It is impossible to establish communism as the immediate successor to capitalism. It is, accordingly, proposed to establish socialism as something which we can put in the place of our present decaying capitalism. Hence, communists work for the establishment of socialism as a necessary transition stage on the road to communism."
England has recently discovered the large extent of communist infiltration into her civil service. In France, the Communist Party is one of the largest single political parties. This is also true in Italy, where the communists made important gains in governmental power in 1962. From the Baltic to the Mediterranean, the Russian hammer and sickle covered the land, and the Soviets turned to the second step of Lenin's plan, the takeover of the masses of Asia. A powerful communist machine headed by Moscow-trained agents had long been entrenched in China, but it was the concessions gained by Stalin at the Yalta and Potsdam Conference, in the absence of Chiang Kai-shek, that opened the door to Soviet conquest. A worldwide communist propaganda campaign was initiated, picturing Mao Zedong as a great agrarian reformer and creating hate for Chiang Kai-shek. Agitation became widespread for a truce between the communist Chinese and the nationalist armies. Pressure was brought for the cessation of U.S. military aid to nationalist China. In 1945, President Truman sent General George Marshall to urge Chiang Kai-shek to take the communists into a coalition government in China. Chiang refused. However, a temporary truce and an arms embargo were effected by General Marshall. Soon after the embargo went into effect, the Chinese Reds, supplied by the Russians with excellent equipment from Manchuria, moved into action again. This tragic turn of events in China raised questions by congressional leaders. And in the summer of 1947, General Albert C. Wedemeyer was sent to China to determine whether the United States should rescind its embargo and send supplies to Chiang's forces. Wedemeyer's report, withheld from Congress and the American public by presidential order, stated that with aid, the nationalist forces could prevent China's fall to the communists. It was 9 years after the communist takeover of China when General Wedemeyer's report was finally published. However, in 1949, the fall of China to the Reds aroused some political personages who spoke out critically. Among them, Congressman John F. Kennedy of Massachusetts, who said, "Over these past few days, we have learned the extent of the disasters befalling China and the United States. Our policy in China has reaped the whirlwind. The continued insistence that aid would not be forthcoming unless a coalition government with the communists was formed was a crippling blow to the nationalist government." This statement was reported in the February 21st, 1949 Congressional Record. President Kennedy must not forget those words. A report on a subsequent investigation by the United States Senate read,
"The Judiciary Committee, in the report it has just issued, finds a conspiracy, communist-inspired, that led to American defeat. High American officials were duped. Policies were influenced that gave the communists their greatest victory."
In the years following the Chinese nationalists' defeat, the Reds have strengthened and consolidated their hold. Poor farmers who owned a few acres of land and objected to communist collectivization and the breakup of their families were liquidated. The dead, more than 20 million. The Chinese call it seomei, which means deprived of existence. At the end of World War II, Soviet troops occupied North Korea to disarm surrendered Japanese forces. By 1948, the Soviet Union had created a new satellite out of North Korea. Over 2,000 Soviet Koreans, Communist Party members from Korean communities in Russian territory, had been placed in control of North Korea. Buttressing these political experts were Soviet and Chinese military advisors and 22,000 Korean troops trained by the Chinese Army. On June 25th, 1950, the communists launched a full-scale invasion of South Korea. American commanders who served in Korea during the fighting returned home bitter and deeply disturbed. To congressional committees, our commanding generals in Korea testified. Mark Clark said, "I was not allowed to bomb the numerous bridges that were across the Yalu River and over which the enemy constantly poured his trucks and his munitions and his killers." Stratemeyer, "You get in war to win it. You do not get in war to stand still and lose it, and we were required to lose it. We were not permitted to win." MacArthur stated, "Such a limitation upon the utilization of available military force to repel an enemy attack has no precedent either in our own history or, so far as I know, in the history of the world." It was a costly war. 54,264 Americans sacrificed their lives. Additional casualties numbered 103,284. A bitter price to pay for losing a war. This pattern of unprovoked aggression was continued by the Chinese Reds throughout Asia. In 1959, their Russian-supplied army overthrew the independent self-governing nation of Tibet. Persecution of the strongly anti-communist Buddhist priests inflamed the devout Tibetans to revolt. This was brutally suppressed by the Chinese Red Army. The religious leader, the Dalai Lama, and thousands of his devoted followers fled to sanctuary in India rather than submit to communist tyranny. To the southeast of Tibet, in Vietnam, the communist Ho Chi Minh masqueraded as leader of the Vietnamese nationalist movement. The French agreed to recognition of the new state, and Ho pledged them his loyal cooperation. However, within 2 months, Ho's forces launched a surprise attack on the French and plunged Vietnam into a war that has cost more than 60,000 casualties and left over 2 million homeless. By 1962, the United States was deeply involved as the struggle spread to South Vietnam. In neighboring Laos, U.S.-trained and equipped Laotian troops have fought a 10-year shadow war against Viet Minh communist invaders. Important as a military backdoor, Laos is the gateway to Thailand and Burma and conquest of Southeast Asia. International communism has a heavy stake in each of these invasions. The 600 million people of communist China are desperately in need of food. and Mao's forced industrialization program is badly in need of raw materials. In Indonesia, communist-supported President Sukarno threatens and reaches for more territory at the expense of the Dutch in New Guinea. International communism has established important beachheads, not only in Europe and Asia, but also in the Middle East and Africa. In nearly every part of the world, they have instigated nationalistic revolts, student riots, assassinations, political unrest, and civil strife. The extent of infiltration and subversion by Kremlin agents in Latin America has been demonstrated in Mexico, El Salvador, Chile, Ecuador, Guatemala, Venezuela, as well as other Latin American countries. Early in 1948, Bogota, Colombia was the scene of a significant demonstration of communism in action. Dr. George Gaitan, popular liberal leader and idol of the Colombian masses, was assassinated. In an attempt to disrupt the 1948 Inter-American Conference and discredit the Colombian government, a well-plotted uprising was touched off by Red agents. They claimed that the Colombian president was responsible for Gaitan's death. Communist-led workers and students seized Bogota radio stations and attacked the Palace of Justice. In all, more than 136 buildings worth over $21 million were destroyed before police subdued the mob. The Colombian National Police have in their files evidence and testimony linking Fidel Castro with the Bogota assassination and riots, and identifying him as a communist agent. Yet warnings as early as 1958 that Fidel Castro was a communist, or a long-time willing tool of world communism, fell on deaf ears in the United States. Instead, leading American news media jumped blindly on the Castro bandwagon, portraying him as a romantic rebel, a Robin Hood, leading a fight for social justice. The pro-Castro atmosphere that resulted brought about withdrawal of military aid to the anti-communist Batista government. Again, as with the fall of China, the United States ordered an embargo at a crucial point in the Cuban revolt. However, Castro's agents in Florida were able to obtain great volumes of fighting equipment, purchased mostly with communist-supplied funds. Millions of dollars from Russian and Chinese subsidies were channeled through secret groups in several Latin American countries. Nathaniel Weil's well-documented book, Red Star Over Cuba, gives details of this, including the quote from Stanley Ross, editor of El Diario de Nueva York, who wrote that Castro bought entire regiments from Batista's officers and on one occasion purchased for $650,000 cash an entire armored train complete with tanks, guns, ammunition, jeeps, and 600 men. With the fall of the Batista government to Castro's shaggy band of revolutionaries on January 1st, 1959, the first completely communist government in the Western Hemisphere was established. To escape the brutal communization of their country, thousands of Cubans have fled to the United States by every possible means. In a 5-hour speech broadcast by Havana Radio on December 2nd, 1961, Fidel Castro removed all doubt when he announced that he had been a communist since his student days at the University of Havana. Nikita Khrushchev welcomed him to the communist ranks and declared, "We must stir up fires where we can. Cuba we have helped and shall help further without fear. The United States did not interfere in Cuba." Thus, Lenin's heirs to the dictatorship of world communism had begun the third and final phase of the master plan, the encirclement of the United States. In the United States, only 90 miles from Cuba, activities of communist agents who called themselves Americans have made headlines. Alger Hiss, who had the confidence of an American president and access to vital secrets. Harry Dexter White, a key man in the U.S. Treasury. Judith Copeland, working amazingly enough in the Justice Department itself. Vernon Mitchell and William Morton, employees of the National Security Administration, who suddenly disappeared with valuable secret information. They turned up in Mexico, then Cuba, then Moscow. Captain Joseph E. Kaufman of the United States Air Force in Europe, convicted of espionage for the Soviets in 1962. This is only a partial list of Americans who have betrayed their country to communism. Here in San Francisco, USA, American university students riot against the House Committee on Un-American Activities. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover issued this special report over his signature. In his report, Mr. Hoover shows how known communist agents infiltrated campuses in the San Francisco area, promoting and inciting more than 1,000 students to riot against the House Committee, which for over 20 years has investigated and exposed communist activities in America. Mr. Hoover also revealed that Gus Hall, national leader of the Communist Party USA, sent congratulations to the West Coast comrades for the initiative and leadership they displayed at all stages of the demonstration. In conclusion, Mr. Hoover issued a sober warning to the people of America. In looking at the riots and chaos communists have created in other countries, many Americans point to the strength of our nation and say, it can't happen here. The communist success in San Francisco in May 1960 proves that it can happen here. The FBI has investigated the enemy at work in all areas of our national life. Congressional committees have documented the fact that communists have penetrated a number of labor unions, communications networks, areas of education, some church organizations, our federal government, our legislative halls, our armed services. These agents are dedicated, highly trained, and secretly working for the overthrow of our nation and the triumph of world communism. By 1950, the first phase of the master plan had brought 116 million people in Eastern Europe under communist domination. In Asia, the second phase has already added 700 million, and activity in Southeast Asia has been intensified by the communists. And now, with the acknowledged communization of Cuba and increasing red penetration in Latin America, a giant step has been taken toward the complete encirclement of America. The communists will allow nothing and no one to stand in their way. Recently, 67-year-old Nikita Khrushchev ranted, "I want to see the red flag flying over the entire world in my lifetime." Khrushchev alternately blows hot then cold about Berlin, creating a crisis when it suits his needs, using the pressure as a wedge to divide the NATO powers, or simply to divert attention from a furtive grab for power in another part of the world. In order to provide the tanks and troops, the money for espionage, propaganda, and subversion, Khrushchev keeps the inhabitants of Russia and its satellites at a bare subsistence level. Terror and intimidation prevent the people from expressing their resentment against a regime which promises so much but gives so little. 67% of the women and the children over 14 are in the labor force. The average Russian's personal income is less than $10 a week in terms of purchasing power. Khrushchev rules a nation where only 4% of the population have any voice in the government, and most of those have only the right to applaud. In his callous climb to power, Khrushchev has been responsible for the suffering and death of millions. The crimes of Khrushchev have been verified by congressional committee witnesses who testified under oath and documented their charges with data and photographs smuggled out of Russia. Among the crimes they charged were 30 years ago, as secretary of the Ukrainian Communist Party, Khrushchev directed the deliberate starvation of Ukrainian peasants who rebelled against forced collectivization of their land. An estimated 6 to 7 million innocent men, women, and children died as a result of this man-made famine. In 1945, Khrushchev supervised the mass arrests of priests and bishops in the Ukraine. At that time, there were 4,400 Catholic churches, 127 monasteries. Today, there are none. In 1956, the Soviet dictator sent Russian tanks and troops to slaughter the Hungarian students and workers who wanted freedom from communist tyranny. Students suspected of sympathy or participation in the revolt were sent to labor camps in Russia. In spite of this massive documentation and warnings from informed sources, there are many Americans today who will not believe the terrible truth about this man who holds supreme power over the Soviet Empire. World communist leaders gathering in Moscow in 1961 for the 22nd Communist Party Congress were told by Khrushchev that the United States has entered a phase of mounting difficulties and crises, the phase of its decline. The victory of socialism on a world scale is no longer far off. Will this fantastic prediction come true? We are a nation of 186 million people, many of whom are totally uninformed or apathetic toward the true nature of this grave problem. We have become a nation in which the responsibilities of citizenship are being ignored. We are encircled by international communism, and the enemy is in our midst. They advocate so-called peace fronts and preach coexistence while working to destroy faith in America's constitutional government and the benefits of private enterprise. We can halt and ultimately destroy the communist master plan for conquest if our people and our leaders have the courage and the will to win this Cold War. We must support our government by being well informed and by taking an active part in government. We must enforce the legal safeguards which enable our government to deal effectively with communist fifth column activities which have penetrated the vitals of our nation. We must stiffen our citizens' and our nation's diplomatic attitude toward the entire communist international conspiracy and the brutal despots leading it. We must arouse our friends and neighbors to a better understanding of the value of personal freedom and to the importance of keeping government close to the people. We must take a clear look at our moral weakening. In our churches, our schools, our homes, we must build the caliber of leadership that a free people must have in order to remain free. It is too late for continued apathy. We must realize the true meaning of patriotism, as did such heroic Americans as Nathan Howe, who chose death instead of tyranny with the proud words, "I only regret that I have but one life to lose for my country." Since our nation was founded, Americans have not faltered when our country was in danger. From the farmers at Lexington and Concord, the frontiersmen at the Alamo, the valiant doughboys who sleep in Flanders, and the Marines on Iwo Jima, Americans have paid the ultimate price for our freedom. This war against communism is your war. At this crucial moment of human history, will you enlist and pledge a part of your mental, physical, material, and spiritual resources in this fight? On the manner in which Americans respond to this challenge rests the future hope of all free men.